Welcome, Seekers of Shadow. Before we dive into the dark, go ahead and press the like button and subscribe. This helps more lost souls find these tales, ensuring you get more of the scares you crave. Now listen closely. This week's collection of tales finds a home in the deep, silent woods, where old debts are paid in flesh and blood. A timberman discovers his family's legacy is a monstrous inheritance, one that collects its due in bone and sorrow. A cynical podcaster's cruel joke becomes a silent, crooked-faced truth that steals his voice and his very story. And a moonshiner learns that some mountain families offer a chilling hospitality, a welcome that demands a terrifying measure of blood. Now, let us enter the darkness. The Timberman's Dead. A lone cello weeps a single mournful note that hangs in the vastness before a chainsaw's roar rips it to shreds. The saw bites deep, its scream echoing against the silent ancient titans of the Cascade Mountains, and then it dies, leaving a ringing silence broken only by the cold wind sighing through the pines. Montgomery Blackwood loved that silence. It was the sound of victory. He stood on conquered ground, the air a heady perfume of sawdust and diesel fuel, and grinned. He was a king in a kingdom of stumps, the third generation of his family to bring this forest to its knees. He saw this lineage not as a history of destruction, but as a sacred duty, a legacy of taming the wild. His father, Wade, the company foreman, had taught him that. Wade was the son Montgomery orbited, a quiet, powerful man who would watch his son work, a look of profound, loving pride in his eyes. "You've got the gift, son," Wade would say, his hand a heavy, reassuring presence on Montgomery's shoulder. "It's in your blood." Montgomery lived for those words. The perfect machine of his life began to shudder when a logger named Pre vanished. His truck was left at the trailhead, a silent metal tombstone. 2 weeks later, another man, Garrett, was gone. This time, they found his chainsaw and beside it, a single terrifying footprint pressed deep into the mud, a print too large, too primal, to belong to any known animal of the woods. The crew's hushed whispers turned to talk of old legends: Sasquatch, Bigfoot, a wild man of the woods that protected its territory. Montgomery's pride wouldn't allow it. He felt a cold knot of fear in his gut, but he buried it under a mountain of scorn. He organized a hunting party. "It's a bear," he declared, his voice a booming command for order. Wade had placed a calming hand on his son's arm. "Patience, Montgomery. Let the sheriff handle it. An accident is an accident. Let's not lose our heads." That night, Montgomery sat in his trailer, the sharp, comforting burn of whiskey in his throat. He drank to quiet the whispers of his crew, to silence the image of that impossible footprint. The bottle became his companion as the weeks wore on. The blackout started then, and the whiskey was a ready-made excuse. He'd wake up in his armchair, the trailer cold, the empty bottle on the floor, with only a vague, throbbing memory of having sat down. It was the drink, he told himself. Just drinking too much. But the evidence became harder to ignore. He woke one morning after a particularly deep, whiskey-fueled sleep to find his expensive hunting boots caked in fresh, dark mud and pine needles. He spent an hour scrubbing them clean, his heart hammering, blaming a drunken, forgotten stumble in the night. Another time, he found a deep, angry scratch on his arm, and later that day saw the exact same mark on one of the company trucks, a long gouge in the paint as if a claw had been dragged across it. He told himself it was a coincidence, then went home and drank until he couldn't think at all. The paranoia festered. He started watching his own crew, wondering if one of them was drugging his whiskey, trying to sabotage him, to drive him mad, He felt a strange, new aggression simmering under his skin, a rage that felt foreign and exhilarating. He snapped at his men, his voice a low growl. Wade pulled him aside. "Easy, son. It's the stress. Maybe lay off the bottle for a bit." The concern in his father's eyes was so genuine, so loving, that it made Montgomery feel ashamed. His father was right. It was the stress. It was the whiskey. It had to be. The true unraveling began in a haze of whiskey and self-deception. He was in his trailer, the world softening at the edges as he sank into the familiar, murky comfort of another blackout. The hum of the small refrigerator seemed to warp and bend. A sound ripped through the fog, a low, guttural roar. For a terrifying liquid moment, he wasn't sure if he'd heard it with his ears or felt it erupting from his own chest. It was a sound of pure rage and pain, and it tasted like iron and ozone in the back of his throat. He felt his own vocal cords vibrate with a sympathetic, bestial snarl that he barely managed to choke back as a cough. The whiskey bottle slipped from his numb fingers, shattering on the floor in a splash that felt distant, as if it were happening in another room. The next morning his father's truck was gone. Panic, cold and sharp, seized him. He drove recklessly to his father's cabin at the edge of the property. The door was ajar. "Dad?" Montgomery called out, his voice thin. The cabin was a mess. A heavy oak table was overturned, and the air hung thick with the coppery sweet smell of blood. And on the floor, amidst the splinters of the broken table, was Wade. His body was savaged, torn apart by a strength that was not human. Montgomery fell to his knees, a sound of pure animal grief tearing from his throat. Beside his father's outstretched hand lay a thick leather-bound journal, its cover smeared with blood. It was his great-grandfather's. Sobbing, his hands shaking so violently he could barely turn the pages, Montgomery opened it. His grief began to curdle into a new, more profound horror. The pages were filled with detailed sketches of the beast, the Bigfoot of legend, and clinical descriptions of the familial affliction. A random gene, the journal explained, that could lie dormant for generations, a monstrous curse tied to the forest itself. Then, tucked into the back, were newer pages, written in his father's neat, steady hand. October 12th. The gene is active in Montgomery. Saw the signs after his first season. The blackouts, the aggression. He doesn't know. He blames the whiskey I leave for him. Good, that is easier. November 3rd. Miller Timber put in a bid for the North Ridge tract. I made an anonymous call about the accidents, and their stock dropped. We'll get the contract now. Montgomery's affliction is a regrettable but effective business asset. December 9th. Another man gone. Montgomery is getting proud. The prouder he is of the work, the more violent the transformations. I must encourage this. It is for the good of the family, for his legacy. The journal slipped from Montgomery's numb fingers. The love he felt for his father, the grief that was a physical weight in his chest, all of it collapsed into a black hole of understanding. His father hadn't been a rock. He had been the stone that sharpened the axe. Every word of praise, every bottle of whiskey left as a gift, had been a lie, a careful nurturing of the monster that had made them rich. He looked from the journal to his father's body, then down at his own hands. He remembered the blackout from the night before. He remembered the roar that he had felt erupting from his own chest. He remembered the smell of blood, now clinging to his own clothes. He remembered the scratches on his arms, the mud on his boots, the rage. The whiskey hadn't been the cause. It had been the camouflage. He hadn't been hunting a monster. He had been living in its skin. The beast hadn't just killed his father. He had. Montgomery didn't scream. The sound was trapped behind the lump of his dead heart. He simply stood over the two truths of his life, the body of the father he had loved, and the words of the monster who had created him, and felt the first familiar, sickening pop in his bones as the sun began to set. The collector was coming, the debt was still due, and for the first time he was awake to see it. The shape of scorn. Every podcaster looks for that one perfect story, the one that makes their name. Some find a legend, others become one. What you're about to hear is the final recording from a podcaster named Norman, who thought he knew a thing or two about monsters. The humid night air of the Black Creek woods was a thick, syrupy cocktail of humidity, pine rot, and Norman's own smug satisfaction. He meticulously adjusted the gain on his expensive audio recorder, the small red light glowing like a malevolent eye in the dark. Across the crackling campfire, his co-producer Ash was performing his role perfectly, nervously scanning the impenetrable wall of trees that pressed in on their small circle of light. The shadows thrown by the fire were deep and distorted, turning familiar shapes into lurking beasts. For Ash, this was a place of legends. For Norman, host of the ruthlessly cynical podcast Fact or Phantoms, it was simply a soundstage. "You're awfully quiet over there, Ash," Norman prodded, his voice a smooth, condescending baritone he'd cultivated for his listeners. He loved the sound of it, the way it conveyed effortless superiority. "Getting spooked? Thinking the great American Bigfoot is going to pop out and ask for an autograph?" Ash just shook his head, pulling his jacket tighter despite the oppressive heat. The constant high-pitched thrum of cicadas seemed to be drilling into his skull. "It's not funny, Norman. This place feels wrong. Old." "It's woods, Ash," Norman sighed, with the exaggerated patience of a man explaining color to the blind. "Trees, dirt, and probably a few raccoons fighting over a dead squirrel. The only thing wrong here is the gullibility of the locals." He leaned into his microphone, the red light reflecting in his eyes. "And speaking of locals, I paid a local drama student, a lanky kid named Kevin, $100 to stomp around in a gorilla suit I bought on Amazon for $79. We're going to capture Ash's 5-star, pants-wetting terror right here, live for your amusement, phantom freaks." The plan was a masterstroke of cruelty, Norman's favorite kind of content. He'd get a viral clip, cement his brand of heartless debunking, and put his overly earnest partner in his place. He'd told the kid, Kevin, to show up at 10 o'clock sharp, make some noise on the ridge for 5 minutes, and then retreat. Simple. Foolproof. 10 o'clock came and went. The fire spit and hissed. The cicadas droned on. Norman felt a prickle of annoyance, a disruption in his perfect schedule. "Damn kid is late," he muttered, checking his phone for the 10th time. No signal. Of course, the isolation was part of the aesthetic, but now it was just an inconvenience. Then a new sound split the night, cutting through the insectile hum. It was a low, guttural growl that seemed to emanate from the very soil beneath them, a vibration felt as much as heard. Ash shot to his feet, a strangled gasp escaping his lips. Norman grinned, relief washing over his annoyance. A little late, but the kid had a flair for the dramatic. "Okay, Kevin. Nice pipes. Getting into character, I see," Norman shouted into the darkness, playing his part for the recording. The response was a heavy, earth-shaking thud from the trees, followed by the sharp, sickening crack of a young tree splintering under immense force. The sound was wrong. It was too heavy, too powerful, too real. Norman's grin faltered. That wasn't in the script. A shape detached itself from the deepest shadows at the edge of the firelight. It was enormous, a hulking silhouette of muscle and matted hair that blotted out the stars. It moved with a slow, deliberate weight that bespoke incredible power. Its stench hit them next, a putrid wave of wet fur, decay, and something rankly animal. Norman's blood ran cold. His mind raced, trying to fit this into his plan. Maybe the kid had brought a friend. Maybe they'd padded the suit. But no amount of padding could account for the sheer, terrifying presence that now stood before them. This wasn't a lanky drama kid in a $79 suit. The creature roared, a sound of pure primal rage that vibrated in Norman's bones and rattled his teeth. He saw two dark eyes like pits of black glass fixate on him. In that moment, his carefully constructed world of cynicism and control shattered into a million pieces. This wasn't a phantom. It was a fact. He scrambled backward, the expensive microphone slipping from his numb fingers. His mind, once a fortress of scornful logic, was now a screaming void of pure animal panic. He saw Ash, and for a split second, a detail registered that his terrified brain couldn't process. Ash wasn't cowering. He was watching Norman with a strange, unreadable expression of cold, grim pity. The creature took another thunderous step closer, and then the world broke. A blinding, white-hot agony erupted behind his left eye, as if a railroad spike had been driven into his brain. The roaring of the beast became a deafening, metallic shriek inside his own head. The forest floor tilted violently. The monstrous shape warped and melted. A horrifying numbness, cold and absolute, cascaded down the left side of his body, a creeping paralysis that stole his breath and his voice. He tried to scream, but his mouth wouldn't obey, his lips pulling down into a grotesque, slack parody of a face. He collapsed onto the damp earth, a broken puppet with its strings cut. He awoke to the sterile smell of antiseptic and the rhythmic beeping of machines that were now measuring the rest of his life. The stroke, the doctor said, was massive. His face was a permanent ruin, a drooping, twisted mask frozen in a silent scream. His voice, once his fortune, was now a mangled, slurring collection of noises that no one could understand. After the insurance money ran out, he was moved to a small, state-funded room, a ghost haunted by the memory of that night. Ash never visited. But one evening, months into his new, silent life, a small package appeared by his door. Inside was a simple cassette player and one tape, labeled only with his name. With his one good, trembling hand, he managed to get the tape into the player. He pressed play. He heard the fire, the cicadas. He heard his own voice, dripping with arrogance as he laid out his cruel prank. Then he heard the roar, his own choked sounds of panic. But after a long silence on the tape, he heard Ash's voice, startlingly clear and calm. "He's down, I think it's over." A second voice replied, deeper, slower, and filled with a profound human sadness. "I didn't mean to. I got angry when he called me a gorilla suit. It's what they all used to call me." "It's not your fault, Dale," Ash's voice said, and now it was filled with years of stored-up emotion. "He did this to himself. Do you remember when we were kids, Dale? Before the Proteus-Hirsutism variant syndrome really took hold? We used to build forts in these woods. You were the kindest kid I knew. Then you got sick, and people like him, they turned you into a monster, a story to scare their kids with. He was going to do the same thing to me. He was going to turn my fear into a joke for his listeners. I couldn't let him. It's time someone told a story about him." The tape clicked off, leaving Norman in the crushing silence of his lonely room. Dale, the name, the memory, the truth, it all crashed down on him. The shy, gentle boy who had vanished from their lives. The hired kid, Kevin, had never been part of the real plan. Ash had set him up. The monster was real, and it had been waiting for him. guided by a friendship Norman had been too cruel to ever understand. His punishment was not just the loss of his face or his voice, it was the complete loss of his story. For he was no longer the narrator. His tale now belonged to others. On certain late-night frequencies in obscure corners of the internet, a new podcast has been gaining a following. Its name is Uncanny Appalachia, and its latest episode begins with an eager, confident host leaning into his microphone. And that brings us, the host's voice proclaims over the hissing static, to the most chilling local legend in the tri-state area, the Crooked Face Man of Black Creek. They say on moonless nights, you can sometimes see him moving through the pines, a twisted, silent figure. Some say he's the ghost of a man who got lost. But the older stories, the ones whispered around campfires, say he was a man who mocked the darkness one too many times, and the darkness simply decided to give him a face to match his soul. So the next time you hear a local legend whispered around a dying fire, ask yourself, what is the true shape of a monster? Is it born of nature, or is it carved by the cruelties we inflict upon each other? A measure of blood. They say hospitality is a sacred trust, a kindness offered to strangers. But in the deepest parts of the woods, some families have a different sort of welcome, and they always collect their debts. The Appalachians held Jack in a familiar embrace, the rutted dirt track beneath his tires a well-worn groove in his routine. Each delivery to Jedediah Thorne was a small victory, a dance on the edge of the law that lined his pockets nicely. Old Jed was an odd one, living so deep in the cut, but he was always good for the agreed-upon price, and their brief exchanges had settled into a comfortable rhythm over the past few months. It was Jed's daughter, Lily, who always pricked at the edges of that comfort. In her early 20s, she moved with a strange, almost drifting gait, her eyes holding a disconcerting blankness. Jack, raised with a politeness his profession often tested, told himself her peculiarities were just the result of a life lived in profound isolation. Yet he couldn't shake the way her features seemed compressed. A nose a little too broad, eyes a touch too wide, a jaw a shade too heavy for the rest of her. It was the kind of look whispered about in the holler, the stark evidence of blood that had circled back on itself too many times. She never spoke, not a single word in all his visits. But her gaze followed him with an unnerving, silent intensity that made the hairs on the back of his neck prickle. The cabin itself was deceptively neat. Orderly stacks of firewood, a swept porch, windows that gleamed. But the air inside always felt stagnant, a cold spot that the summer sun couldn't burn away. And there was that smell, a faint, musky sweetness that clung to the shadows, a scent he couldn't quite place and tried not to dwell on. He was there for the exchange. The weight of the cash in his hand a welcome distraction from the subtle unease that always settled upon him the moment he stepped onto Thorne land. He was young, focused on the hustle, and the strangeness of the Thorne family was simply the price of doing business. A classic, youthful oversight. This delivery felt different from the start. A heavier silence hung in the air as he cut the engine. Jed was waiting on the porch, his usual crinkled smile stretched thin, a touch too wide to be genuine. He was more talkative than usual, his words veering into strange territory as he counted out the bills. "Family's got needs, you see, Jack," he'd rasped, his eyes glinting in a way Jack hadn't noticed before. "Needs for new blood. A strong line has its price, always has." The words were unsettling, a glimpse into the insular world of the Thornes, but Jack, eager to be on his way, just chuckled nervously, attributing it to the eccentricities of an old man living too long in the solitude of the mountains. The trap snapped shut with a speed that stole Jack's breath. As he reached for the money, Jed's hand clamped onto his wrist with surprising strength, his friendly mask dissolving into a cold, predatory glare. "The price is you, boy," he hissed, his grip like iron. Jack reacted instantly, adrenaline surging. He wrenched his arm free, stumbling backward into a doorway he hadn't noticed before. A dark, low-ceilinged room that smelled of damp earth and something else. Something metallic. His heart slammed against his ribs. The room was filled with unsettling objects. Crude, hand-carved figures with too many limbs and vacant eyes. Strange symbols painted in what looked like dried blood. But it was the shelf along one wall that froze his blood. Row upon row of dusty glass jars sat filled with a murky, viscous liquid. And within that liquid floated things. Small, pale pieces of what looked sickeningly like human flesh. A few held delicate, finger-like bones. The musky sweetness in the air was suddenly identifiable, nauseatingly so. Jed's earlier words about new blood, the sight of the preserved remains, a wave of primal terror washed over Jack. The only logical explanation, the only horror his mind could immediately grasp, was cannibalism. This wasn't just an odd family. It was a hidden clan of savages, and he had just stumbled into their larder. He wasn't a business contact, he was potential sustenance. This terrifying realization fueled his desperate need to escape. A brutal struggle erupted as Jed lunged. Jack, fueled by sheer terror, fought back, landing a wild punch that sent the old man staggering. He burst back through the doorway and out onto the porch, the sound of splintering wood echoing behind him. He scrambled for his truck, but his hand met only the cold air where his tires should have been, slashed beyond useless. He had no choice but to run. He plunged into the dense, unforgiving woods, the undergrowth tearing at his clothes, his lungs burning with each desperate stride. Behind him, he heard Jed's guttural yells. But there was something else, too. A low padding sound, the rustle of leaves moving without a breeze, the unnerving sense of being pursued by more than one, moving with a silent, unnatural coordination. In his panicked flight, a fleeting image flashed through his mind, a glimpse of something large and dark moving between the trees, too quick, too heavy. A primal fear whispered the word Bigfoot, a legend of these very woods, but he dismissed it as the frantic imaginings of a terrified man. This had to be human. It had to be. After what felt like an eternity of stumbling through the darkness, the blessed relief of asphalt appeared ahead. He burst onto the main road, gasping for breath, his body screaming in protest. Then, a miracle. Headlights cutting through the night. A police cruiser. His savior. The officer was calm, his voice reassuring as he listened to Jack's frantic, disjointed story of the cannibalistic family in the woods. He offered a bottle of water, a small kindness that felt like the first taste of salvation. Jack, parched and desperate, drank deeply, the cool liquid a balm on his raw throat. The world swam. The officer's face blurred, his calm expression hardening into something cold and knowing. The relief Jack had felt evaporated, replaced by a chilling certainty. The water, it had been laced with something. The officer wasn't his rescuer. He was part of it. His last conscious thought was the officer's eyes, devoid of any human warmth, before the darkness claimed him. He awoke to a heavy, cloying silence, the taste of something metallic thick on his tongue. His limbs felt leaden, unresponsive. He was strapped to a cold, hard surface, the air around him thick with the same musky sweetness he'd smelled in the cabin, now mingled with the antiseptic tang of something sterile. A slow, rhythmic pressure against his arm revealed the horror. Crude, makeshift tubes were connected to his veins, and a cold, viscous liquid was seeping into his bloodstream. He strained against the restraints, panic clawing at his throat, but his body remained stubbornly unresponsive. With a monumental effort, he turned his head. In the dim, flickering light cast by a single bare bulb hanging overhead, he saw it. The jars. They weren't the larder. They were tributes, offerings, preserved samples of what sustained this. It wasn't a Bigfoot, it wasn't a wild animal. It was a creature of human origin, twisted and broken by generations of inbreeding, a mockery of the human form. Grotesquely deformed, its skin stretched taut over a skeletal frame. It lay on a crude throne of rusted metal and decaying blankets. Tubes snaked from Jack's arm to a network of wheezing, sputtering machinery that pulsed with a sickening regularity, feeding directly into the creature's pallid, almost translucent veins. Its eyes, milky and unseeing, still held a flicker of something ancient, something disturbingly sentient. The moonshiner's purpose was never to be eaten. He was a vessel, a source. The new blood Jed had spoken of wasn't for a family. It was for this, Alpha. The jars held the vital essence of those who had come before him, each one a testament to the family's horrific devotion. Jack wasn't a meal. He was the next measure of blood, slowly being drained, drop by agonizing drop, to sustain the monstrous patriarch of a bloodline that had festered in the darkness for far too long. The rhythmic sigh of the antiquated pump was the only sound in the room, a chilling metronome counting down the moments of his living entombment, his final delivery not of illicit liquor, but of his very life force, to the unholy thing that the Pines had kept secret for generations. The next time you accept a stranger's kindness, ask yourself, what measure of blood will it cost?